My favorite doctor and your favorite lecturer, Dr. Herbert M. Shelton.
Thank you, Mr. Doolin. This evening, I'm to talk to you on a subject that for some reason or other we have neglected in the past. I do not believe that we have talked on this subject at any of our subsequent, or rather any of our previous conventions. And yet it is, and especially in the present time is it, a very important subject, that of the relation of natural hygiene to what we know as mental and nervous diseases. Since man began to think, and sometimes I wonder if he has been trying to understand mind. In the past, and to a large extent even in the present, he has tried to understand mind disassociated from the human constitution. Philosophers, metaphysicians, and the older psychologists studied mind in the abstract. They looked upon it as something independent of the body, some kind of an entity that was so superior to the physical body that it hardly had any connection with it. It was Aristotle, I believe, who first suspected that the brain was the seat of the human intellect. But it was just the intellect and not the rest of those functions that we know as mental functions that he associated with the brain. The heart and the liver and the spleen and other organs of the trunk were regarded as seats of the various emotions. And when in the Bible there is the statement that as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, you must keep in mind in reading that the man who wrote that statement and the people to whom he addressed it actually believed that the thinking was done with the heart. It was not a figure of speech. It was intended to be taken literally at that time. It was not until Gall, nearly 200 years ago, proved that the brain is the organ of the mind, that a real study of the physiology of the mind could begin. Now, Gall is a man whose name is rarely mentioned. They're beginning to mention him a little bit more now in scientific literature than they have in the past, because in addition to his great studies of the structure and functions of the brain, he devised a system that he called craniology, which later became known as phrenology, which was an effort to delineate human character and determine what men and women were fitted for by examination of the cranium. It was a very plausible, a very captivating theory as he and his co-workers worked it out, but it finally became regarded as a form of quackery, and the psychologist who had previously held the field came back to take over. Nonetheless, the study of the function of the brain, or the functions of the brain, has continued, and a great part of what Gall taught has been demonstrated to be true. Now, among the things that he taught was that the brain is not an organ, but a whole series of organs. And while today we do not speak of brain organs as he did, we speak of brain centers, each center having its own specific function to perform, and no center performing the function of any other. It is due to the fact that we have these different brain centers, each of which performs its own particular function, that damage to one part of the brain produces one kind of trouble, and damage to another part of the brain produces another type of trouble. When once we realize that the brain is the organ of the mind, and without the brain there is no mental action, we can readily understand that aberrations of the mind, or of mental function, have their seat or have their origin in disease of the brain. Disease of the brain means insanity, or paralysis, or idiocy, or some other type of trouble, depending upon the type and the location of the physical disturbance of that congeries of organs. There is only one other organ in the human body that rivals the brain in its number of functions, and that is the skin. Perhaps you had not thought of the skin as an organ, but it is. It's actually the largest organ in the body and serves many functions. To get back to our brain, anything that injures in any way that brain will impair mental function. We see delirium in fever. We see positive insanity in drunkenness, whether it's alcoholic drunkenness or some other type. We see confusion and even the abolition of consciousness in narcosis and in anesthesia. And we see confusion of mental function in the individual who is recovering from a state of narcosis or a state of anesthesia. And we know that there are many drugs, such, for example, as the sulfa drugs that had a great vogue but a few years ago, that produce positive insanity and drive people to suicide. The sleeping pills of various kinds, and opium or morphine, and various other types of drugs that have been used extensively in the past, have been responsible for great numbers of cases of mental derangement and of insanity of one type or another. Hardening of the arteries in the brain that cuts off the blood supply to the brain results in impairment of mental function, results in a gradual deterioration of the mind of the individual. Within the last few years, the medical profession has come up with the discovery that insanity can be produced by drugs. Most of the world has known it for a long time. And they are looking around for more and more drugs with which they can produce insanity. For some reason or other, they think that if they can find drugs that will produce insanity, they can ultimately find drugs that will remedy insanity. This, of course, is a resort to their common practice of ignoring causes and trying to force organs to behave normally by some kind of violent means. It is not logical to think that if drugs will produce insanity, drugs will also remedy insanity. It is more logical to think that if drugs will reproduce insanity, the way to get rid of the insanity is to get away from the drugs. The way to prevent insanity is not to take the drugs. Instead of that, we live in an age and in a time and in a place in which more and more and more poisoning is being constantly introduced into the human organism. Not merely in the form of tobacco and alcohol and tea and coffee and cocoa and chocolate and antacids and headache remedies, so-called, and constipation remedies of one kind or another, and the prescriptions of the physicians, and their vaccines and their serums and their alleged medicines, but also in the forms of additives to our foods, adulterants, preservatives, coloring matters, and in the forms of sprays that are sprayed upon the foods in the orchard, and in the forms of those of you who are foolish enough to make graveyards of your stomach and bury dead animals in them, in the forms of gland extracts and preservatives. The gland extracts that are added are fed to the animals, and the preservatives that are added to the animal food after the animal is killed. Those of you who eat flesh may be reasonably sure that you're eating embalmed flesh. All of these sources of poison are everyday sources in our culture today. You get them in everything and from all sides. Now, it is not likely that there is any poison that can be taken into the human body. The worse the condition becomes, and then after a time they resort to another form of treatment which is even worse in its effects upon the patient, the so-called shock treatment. Now, shock is definitely injurious at all ages and in all conditions of life. All types of shock are injurious. But the shock treatment results in hemorrhages into the brain. It results in damages of brain cells. And at autopsy, the brain of a person who has received considerable shock treatment resembles a sponge. So much damage has been done to that brain, and so many blood clots have been formed in that brain as a consequence of the shock. It is quite true that occasionally somebody makes a temporary recovery from their condition in spite of shock, just as people are continually making partial and temporary recoveries from various other conditions in spite of crucifying treatment of all kinds. And they've been doing it all down the ages, no matter what the form of treatment. But it is also true that these people who apparently recover from their mental troubles as a consequence of shock or in spite of shock have relapses sooner or later and are back in the institution for more shock treatment. Ultimately, the case becomes hopeless. That kind of treatment would make a person insane who was perfectly sane to start with. And if there are any of you who doubt it, I make just one suggestion which ought to relieve you of your doubts in a very short time, and that is, make of yourself a guinea pig and let them give you a series of shock treatments to see for yourself if they will not make you insane. Here we deal with the old method of producing one disease to cure another. Remember the old law of cure that the so-called scientific school of medicine paraded before the world for so many years. The law of cure that gave them the name allopath, which is merely a word coined from two Greek roots meaning another suffering. That law of cure was that contraries cure opposites. Contraria contraries cura. Contraries cure opposites. Then the homeopaths came upon the scene. They had an opposite kind of law of cure. And the word homeopathy is a coined word from two Greek roots which means a similar suffering. And their law of cure was similia similibus curantur, which simply means like cures like. Each of them were engaged in the practice of producing disease, to cure disease. One produced a similar disease, the other an opposite disease, but they were both producing disease to cure disease. And believe it or not, both groups of them are still engaged in the same practice. Shocking people into sanity is merely trying to produce a case of insanity to cure insanity. I can't think of anything that is more illogical and more likely to damage the poor victim of the ancient superstition that diseases can and should be cured than this resort to shock treatment and insanity. But they go so far as to operate on the brain and remove part of the brain. I don't think that would make a great deal of difference to most people. From my experience, and I admit that it has been limited because caring for these cases requires special accommodations. They can't be kept with other patients. So that my experience has been limited, but it has also been sufficiently extensive to justify me in saying what I am about to say. From my experience in handling mental and nervous troubles, and I think I'm placing the emphasis tonight on mental troubles because we handle a lot of nervous cases all along, I believe firmly that if hygienists were admitted to the mental institutions of the country, I mean as practitioners now, not as patients, and given a free hand in the care of these cases, that instead of being compelled to build more and bigger hospitals in which to house the ever-growing army of mentally ill, that within 3 to 5 years we could close a great number of these institutions that are already overcrowded. I have no doubt of it. I have taken patients that escaped from mental institutions and were caught and dragged back screaming and clawing, trying to get away, for whom no hope was held out. And I have seen these patients recover in periods ranging from 3 to 9 months. One of my patients, it required 9 months to recover from her insanity after she escaped from the state hospital and was dragged back in the manner in which I have just described, later became the secretary of the mayor of San Antonio and served as had the reputation of being one of the finest secretaries in the city. I have seen a few cases that required longer than 9 months for recovery, and I've seen a number that required a much shorter time than 9 months, as little as 3 for recovery. And I know one man that, after he recovered from a state of insanity at my place, became a well-known radio commentator. I won't tell you his name, because you might think that he hasn't recovered yet.